Everville, second book of the art. As I mentioned in my Great and Secret Show retrospective, the last book in the books of the art. I mean, even this one, I'm sure this one says somewhere that there are going to be 4 books in this series. And no, there are not going to be 4 books in this series. And not unless somebody else picks up this franchise and starts writing it themselves, and sort of like how people have done with H.P. Lovecraft's mythology. That's entirely possible because this is at least as expansive as Lovecraft's mythology, so I don't see why not. But no, this is, if you're going to read the books of the art, this is it. I'm afraid this is the last one. And no, the Scarlet Gospels does not fucking count. That it may as well exist in a different universe, quite frankly, because the Harry D'Amour character, the consistent character in Barker's fiction, who turns up in the Scarlet Gospels, which is somewhere up there. Can't quite see where at the moment. It's somewhere up there. It's a different character entirely to the one who occurs in this, and it's a different world. It's a different mythology. For example, the Harry D'Amour who appears in the Scarlet Gospels makes no reference to this. He makes no reference to what he uncovers in this, and what is actually, I'll talk about it when I get into the Scarlet Gospels, because this could very easily turn into a bit of a rant. But Everville's the sequel to the Great and Secret Show. But what's great about Everville is that it does that wonderful thing whereby you don't really have to have read the Great and Secret Show to understand it or to get something out of it. It helps. It helps because you will understand the resonances and significance of certain characters and certain concepts, but you don't have to. You could read them in any which way and it will still make sense. What's really fun about this book is that it takes the intentions and agendas of the original book and moves them on. It expands them enormously. So the first book was an attempt to create a sort of postmodern mythology for the USA. This does exactly the same thing, but it takes in numerous other conceptions within US culture and history and then expounds upon them. So you have a certain quality of the sort of the colonial era coming into this, the founding, the notion of the founding of new towns and new nations, of city builders and whatnot, of the dream of the USA being exposed, being explored in terms of not only its fallibility, in terms of its corruption, but also in terms of its potential. It's really fascinating. It's a peculiarly American book written by a British author. It's an odd thing, very odd thing. It's set in the eponymous town of Everville, which is a little fictional American mountain town, sort of in the Rockies. And it was founded by a woman named Maeve O'Connell. And Maeve O'Connell was the daughter of an Irish settler in the USA. But also, as it turns out, something else. I mean, there is an entire, as there was a mythology running under the synthetic town of Palamo Grove, which in many respects is the antithesis of Everville. There is this subtle back mythology running under the town of Everville, which none of its current residents know about and would not accept even if they did. It takes a sort of historical, expansive look at cultures within the USA, within little towns, and explores how the people who live in them have very definite ideas of what they are and of what they want them to be, which are entirely false, which are largely ignorant of history, of the blood and the pain and the sheer malevolence that went into their foundations. And it marries that concept to the mythology of quiddity, of the dream sea, of the nuncio, the metaphysical substance that can make gods out of human beings, and reintroduces several other characters, several of characters from the Great and Secret Show, like Harry D'Amour. Harry D'Amour plays a much bigger part in this one, by the way. Tesla Bombeck, who is one of the major protagonists of the Great and Secret Show, who is a nunciate. She is a character who ostensibly died in the Great and Secret Show, but was resurrected by the Nuncio as a slightly more than human version of herself, who in this book is brilliantly written because she's a character who has another character in her head. She has this character called Raoul, who was kind of killed like her in the last book, but whose soul, whose mind is now in her head with her, and she's sharing her skull space with this other creature. It's kind of weird. It's kind of bizarre and intimate and strange, and it works really well. It works very, very well indeed. On top of that, you have what I love about the way Tesla Bombeck is explored is even though she's a nunciate, even though she has the nuncio inside of her, and is therefore slightly more than human, she's not um, she's not all knowing. She's not divine. She's not sort of all powerful. She doesn't know what's going on any more than anybody else. She just has this more fluid connection to it now. And I love that. She's as mysterious to herself as she is to everyone else. And I love that. I love the fact that a character that could be very simplistic in terms of her mythology actually becomes way more complex and more interesting. And that's something you get a lot from Barker books. You also have the return of antagonist Kissoon, who is explored in a little bit more detail in this book in terms of what he wants. And like all of Barker's more engaging villains, he's not a villain, not really. You find out who he is and where he comes from and what's motivating him. And he's not, he has, or as vile as he gets, and he's a very vile, unpleasant character, but no more so than many of the others. He he has a motivation that's understandable. You can get where he's coming from in this series, and that's kind of fun. I really, really like that. You also get to see a little bit more of the dream life of humanity, of the Sea of Quiddity, the islands of the ephemeris. You get to see the states and the cities and the worlds that inhabit the Dream Sea, and also what the Dream Sea does, how it operates, what it does to people who end up in it. That's kind of fun. And also of the forces that are at play across it. There is a particular force that was introduced in the Great and Secret Show called the Iadu-Roborus. And the Iadu-Roborus, it's kind of unclear as to what it is. Barker keeps it deliberately vague, but it's simultaneously a nation of entities and also an expression of something human. It's almost like the darkness and the pain and the nihilism of humanity made manifest as this all consuming force. What I love is the way it's introduced, both in this book and in The Great and Secret Show. He describes it, the people who look upon it can't really get a bead upon it because it's not like anything. There's no analog for it, but it's very Lovecraftian in that regard. They describe it as the Iadu-Roborus appear as nations of living mountains upon which flea-like entities that are the size of small continents swarm. And their very presence is enough to elicit all the very worst in humanity. When people look upon them, or when they're close, or when their influence occurs, it makes people collapse in states of nihilistic sadism and masochism and despair. They feel the very worst emotions all coming at once whenever the Iad are around. And that's very cool. They're a force of pure negativity, of pure anti-creation. And that's very cool. And it's that Kissoon is trying to harness. He actually, there's a really weird point in which he's riding the Iadu-Roborus through the streets of Everville. And it's really peculiar. It's very, very strange. The imagery in this book is much stranger. It takes the absurdia and the surrealism that occurs within the Great and Secret Show and ramps it up by a factor of n and makes it so bizarre. It's wonderful. In that regard, it's absolutely wonderful. You also get to see the faces of other players, of other characters who know about these mythologies and who are trying to benefit from them, or who are trying to further certain agendas. There's a character called Owen Budenbaum who is really interesting, neither an antagonist nor a protagonist, who is sort of behind the creation and establishment of Everville, but established it for a very particular reason, and is one of the rare gay protagonists, even in Barker's fiction, who I really like. I really like the fact that he is gay, but incidentally gay, and that somehow has something to do with his mythological intentions as well. It's very, very cool. You get certain resonances in him that are echoed in Will Rabjohn's in Sacrament, and I really like that. You also get the return of characters like the children of the Jaff and Fletcher from the previous book, who have their mythology tied up in this. Their stories are tied up here. And it's really quite grim. It's really unpleasant. What I really like about this book is that it doesn't allow sentiment to settle in. It doesn't allow the characters to have happily ever after, which you might have expected at the end of the Great and Secret show. No, it doesn't allow for that at all. It actually goes the other way and establishes that the mythology is much bigger and more expansive and more complex than anyone ever preconceived, including Fletcher and the Jaff and everyone else involved. I really like that. I really like that. The ending of this book is not clean. It's not all tied up. There's a lot of mythological threads left dangling because, of course, Barker thought that he was going to be writing other books in this series, which I sincerely, sincerely doubt he is at this point. So if you don't mind the fact that the mythology is not finished and certain aspects of the story are not finished, actually, you may get a lot out of this, especially if you want your fiction genuinely surreal. I mean, this is absurd and extreme metaphysical horror ramped up to the power of N. There's imagery in this book that you will see in no other fiction. There are ideas in this book that you will see in no other fiction, and that makes it worthwhile in and of itself, whether it's finished or not. It is kind of a sad end to the mythology of the art. I would dearly love to see more installments in it. I would love to see it explored more. I'd love to see it maybe even tied up, maybe even potentially tied into certain other mythologies that occur. I mean, that's certainly what Barker does in this book with Harry D'Amour. It is tied into certain other mythologies. Like, D'Amour is very Catholic at the beginning of this book. Despite everything he's seen, despite everything he's experienced, he still sees things in terms of God and the devil, in terms of heaven and hell, in terms of good and evil. And what he finds out by the end is that's not the case. That the things he's encountered that seem to be demonic are not. They're things from across the Sea of Dreams. They're things from Quiddity and the Ephemeris that have slipped through and either masquerade as those entities in the interests of influencing humanity in particular ways, or have adopted the stories that humanity tell itself to such a degree that they actually believe they are demons and angels and whatnot. And that's really cool. What it does is it allows Harry D'Amour to expand in terms of his preconceptions, to put them down, and for his own personal mythology to expand. In that regard, Harry is a vessel for the reader. He's an avatar for the reader. That's what this book is trying to do. Especially if you're American, if you happen to be from the USA, this book is talking directly to you. It's trying to get you to put down your preconceptions of history, of culture, of the towns where you live, the places that you inhabit, and to examine them from a more broad perspective. And I mean, what more could you ask, especially from a piece of fiction that is ostensibly popular, that had some sales behind it? What more could you possibly want? Now, I don't know what's next. I don't know what to do next. I could do Galilee. I could do some of Barker's children's fiction, actually. And yes, he has written children's fiction, The Thief of Always and The Aberrat. I'm not sure yet. I'll see what I feel like when I come to it. But that is Everville, and that's kind of sadly the end of the books of the art for now, which kind of sad, but at the same time, the books themselves are so good, I'm not entirely sure I would even want them to be added to. At the risk of diluting or ruining this mythology, I kind of like it where it is.